You know, usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this underlying expectation of precision.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
It's like engineering or something. You know, you fall off a ladder, you break your arm, and the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen.
Right, and the doctor just points at it.
Exactly. There's no debate. I mean, there's no ambiguity.
Because it's binary. It's either broken or not broken.
Yeah.
You don't have to argue over the hermeneutics of a fractured femur. It's comforting to have things categorized with that absolute, undeniable clarity.
But the moment you step into the world of eschatology
Oh, boy.
and systematic theology, that X-ray machine just shatters. We are suddenly looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky.
Very murky.
So today we are taking the stack of source material that you've been working through, you know, the biblical texts, the historical theology, the exegetical debates, and we are wading into the absolute culmination of systematic theology.
We're dealing with the end of all things.
Right, the climax of redemptive history. And the stakes, I mean, they could not be higher.
Which is exactly why this doctrine has historically generated, the most turbulence in the church.
Yeah, for sure.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters if you lack the right exegetical tools.
It really is.
We are entering the territory where, the prophecy charts come out.
Oh, the charts.
The whiteboards get covered in timelines, and a massive amount of heat is generated with, frankly, very little light.
Right. And if you've been with us through our previous deep dives, you know we've spent a massive amount of time laying the groundwork for this.
You really have.
We established the foundations of Christology, how God took on flesh, the hypostatic union of Christ's divine and human natures, his first coming, his finished atoning work on the cross.
All the vital past anchors.
Exactly. We've looked at the prolegomena, which is just the theological term for how we even know what we know in the first place.
Yeah, those were the foundations.
Yeah.
Now we are bridging the gap from that finished work in the past to our definitive future hope.
Right.
Today is really about the transitional mechanics. Next time, we'll look all the way forward to the eternal state, the new heavens and the new earth.
That's going to be a good one.
It is. But our focus right now is firmly on what happens in between. So Christ's return, the tribulation, and the millennium.
And we have to establish the stakes right out of the gate here. Eschatology is not a parlor game for Christians.
No, it's not.
It's not an exercise in speculative chart making so you can sit around feeling like you've decoded some secret geopolitical puzzle in the Middle East.
Right. It's not a conspiracy theory.
Exactly. This doctrine is deeply doxological, meaning it should actually result in worship.
Yes.
And it is heavily formational. What we believe about the end actually shapes our orthopathy.
Which is our affections.
Yeah.
What we long for.
Right. And it shapes our orthopraxy, so how we actually live, how we love, and how we endure suffering today.
Think about the practical application of that. If your view of the end times only makes you terrified.
Which is common.
Very common.
Yeah.
Or worse, if it makes you arrogant because you think, you're the only one in your study group who has figured out the timeline.
Right.
Then your theology is fundamentally failing its biblical purpose. The biblical purpose of eschatology is comfort, its holiness, and its worship.
Yeah, said.
The way you view the end will dictate how you counsel a grieving widow.
Right.
Or how you view your civic duties.
Yeah.
How you handle cultural marginalization, and how you preach the gospel in a hostile world.
So we are going to cut through that popular level confusion today. We're going to rigorously examine the exegetical frameworks, the Greek terminology, and the historical reception of these end times views.
And to do that safely without, excommunicating everyone who disagrees with us.
Right, which we want to avoid.
We have to rely heavily on the four-level theological taxonomy.
Yes. For graduate-level theological work, this taxonomy is basically your lifeline. You have to properly weigh your doctrines. So level 1 is dogma.
The core stuff.
Exactly. These are the core essential Christian truths. The Trinity, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, justification by faith.
If you deny level 1, you step outside of historical orthodoxy, period.
Right. Then level 2 is doctrine. These are denominational or, ecclesial convictions.
The things that dictate which church you belong to.
Right. Things like credo baptism versus paedo baptism, or having a Presbyterian versus a congregational church polity.
Right. And then you get to level 3, which represents theological inferences.
Okay.
These are the logical deductions and the systematic models we build from the text.
So connecting the dots.
Exactly. And finally, level 4 represents speculative opinions. These are the open questions where the biblical text is largely silent or, highly ambiguous.
And we really have to keep those categories active in our minds today. I mean, the bodily return of Jesus Christ to judge the living and the dead.
That is level 1 dogma,
Every Orthodox Christian throughout history agrees on that.
unanimously.
But the exact sequence of the 7 trumpets in Revelation, or how they relate to the modern state of Israel.
That sits firmly in level 3.
Right.
And it leans heavily into level 4, depending on how granular your timeline actually gets.
And if we elevate a level 3 timeline model to a level 1 test of fellowship, we just fracture the body of Christ unnecessarily.
They really do.
We can maintain a robust Protestant, Reformed, and evangelical confessional baseline while exhibiting, deep ecumenical charity toward brothers and sisters in other historical traditions who organize the timeline differently.
Charity is key here.
So let's start where all good systematic theology must start.
The text itself.
The text. Specifically, the scriptural grammar, the vocabulary of the king's return. Eschatology hinges entirely on rigorous hermeneutics and the specific Koine Greek terms used by the biblical authors.
Because if you get the vocabulary wrong, the entire framework just collapses.
It totally does.
The first century audience didn't have a blank slate when they heard these words. The New Testament writers didn't just invent a secret new vocabulary for the end of the world.
Right.
They took existing, culturally loaded Koine Greek words and baptized them with redemptive cosmic meaning.
I love that phrase. Baptize them with redemptive meaning.
Yeah, and if we don't understand how a first century Roman citizen heard these words, we will inevitably project our 21st century anxieties onto the text.
Which happens all the time. So let's break down the big 4 terms from our source material, starting with the most dominant one, parousia.
Right.
Spelled P-A-R-O-U-S-I-A. In our English Bibles, it usually just gets translated as coming.
Like in 1 Thessalonians 4:15 or Matthew 24:27.
Exactly. But coming is an incredibly weak English equivalent. I mean, if I tell you I'm coming over to your house, it just implies movement from point A to point B.
Right, because in the ancient Greco-Roman world, a parousia wasn't just a commute. It was a highly technical civic term for a royal visit, an official state visit by an emperor, a king, or a high-ranking military official to a Roman province.
And it was a huge deal.
Oh, massive. When the emperor's parousia was announced, usually months in advance, the city would go into absolute overdrive.
They were levying special taxes to pay for it.
Exactly. They coined new money, they repaired the roads, they cleaned all the monuments.
Preparing for the arrival.
And when the day finally arrived, the civic leaders and the citizens wouldn't just wait in their houses.
Right.
They would literally leave the city gates to go out and meet the visiting dignitary on the road. They'd officially greet him and then escort him back into the city in a massive triumphant procession.
So it was public, it was loud, it was deeply political, and it was glorious.
Exactly. And you have to keep that civic imagery in mind because it completely changes how we read the New Testament.
Okay, so what's the second word?
The second word is apocalypsis.
Okay, and obviously we get the English word apocalypse from this.
We do.
But if you say apocalypse today, people immediately think of, like, a zombie wasteland, nuclear fallout, or some dystopian survival movie.
Right, it's been totally hijacked by Hollywood.
Totally hijacked.
But apocalypsis simply means an unveiling or a public manifestation. It's like pulling the curtain back on a stage.
So not a nuclear bomb.
No, not at all. You see it in 2 Thessalonians 1:7 and 1 Peter 1:7. The theological concept here is that Christ's absolute sovereignty and glory are currently veiled from the unbelieving world.
Okay.
He is seated at the right hand of the Father. He's currently ruling. But the world doesn't see it. They operate as if Caesar is on the throne.
Right.
So the apocalypsis is the moment the veil is dropped. It is the public manifestation of a reality that has been true all along.
So it's not primarily about earthly destruction?
No, it's about ultimate reality being fully disclosed to everyone simultaneously.
Wow. Okay, then we have the third term, epiphania, which gives us the word epiphany.
Right.
Paul uses it in Titus 2:13 when he says, "We are waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ."
Epiphania.
Yeah, and it carries a specific nuance of visible splendor. It's like a brilliant shining forth in the darkness.
In classical Greek literature, epiphania was often used to describe the sudden, glorious appearance of a deity to rescue people in distress.
Oh, interesting.
Or like a general arriving at the absolute perfect moment to save an army from slaughter.
So it's a rescue mission.
It's a rescue mission, but one draped in blinding, unmistakable light.
Man, that's beautiful. And that brings us to the fourth word, where the theological fireworks usually happen in modern evangelicalism.
Here we go.
Harpazo.
Yes, harpazo.
It's a verb that means to snatch away or to catch up. We find it most famously in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, where Paul says believers will be caught up together in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air.
Right. And when Jerome translated the Greek New Testament into the Latin Vulgate, he used the Latin verb rapimur, or rapturo, for harpazo.
Which is the origin of our English word rapture.
Exactly.
And I really want to push back aggressively on how this specific word is weaponized today.
Please do.
In modern pop culture Christianity, especially over the last, 50 years with the Left Behind book series and various apocalyptic movies.
This is huge.
The rapture has been depicted as this clandestine, secret, terrifying disappearance.
Right.
People suddenly vanishing from airplanes, driverless cars crashing on the interstate, piles of folded clothes just left on church pews while the world falls into chaos.
It's terrifying.
But look at the biblical vocabulary we just walked through. If a parousia is a loud, civic, triumphant arrival of an emperor, why would our orthopathy be marked by apocalyptic dread or a desire for a stealthy escape?
Well, it shouldn't be. The historical context completely shatters the secret rapture concept.
It really does.
Look at the immediate context of 1 Thessalonians 4. Paul explicitly says the Lord will descend with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of the trumpet of God.
That is not a quiet event.
Oh, that is arguably the loudest, most public, most unignorable verse in the entire Bible. There was absolutely nothing secret or stealthy about it.
Right. When Paul couples the verb harpazo, being snatched up, with the noun parousia, he is invoking that exact Roman civic protocol we talked about earlier. We are the welcoming committee.
Precisely. When the emperor approaches the city, the citizens are snatched up or rushed out of the city gates to meet him in the open field.
Right.
But they don't meet the emperor in the field and then run away with him back to Rome for 7 years.
No.
They meet him in the air, so to speak, only to immediately turn around and escort the conquering king back to the domain. He has come to rule.
Exactly.
The idea of being snatched away to privately retreat to heaven while the earth burns for 7 years is completely foreign to the linguistic DNA of the word parousia. The vocabulary demands a picture of public, glorious victory on earth.
So understanding how Christ returns with this very public, definitive, unveiled vocabulary forces us to organically confront the next major theological minefield.
The timing.
Right. If he's returning like a conquering king, when does he do it in relation to the tribulation?
Okay, so the concept of the tribulation finds its roots deep in the Old Testament, specifically in Daniel 9:24 through 27.
Okay.
This is the famous, highly complex prophecy of Daniel's 70 weeks. In biblical apocalyptic literature, a week represents a period of 7 years.
Right.
Daniel is told that 70 weeks, or 490 years, are decreed for his people to put an end to sin and bring in everlasting righteousness.
And the debate hinges on the final 70th week.
Yes, a final 7-year period of intense global turmoil. And Jesus picks up this exact thread in his Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, where he warns of a great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now.
And this is where we have to apply the taxonomy again. The bodily return of Christ to judge and restore is level 1 dogma.
Right.
But the exact sequencing of this 7-year tribulation period, and specifically when the church is resurrected and glorified in relation to it, falls squarely into level 3 theological inferences.
Absolutely.
And over the last 2 centuries, good, Orthodox, Bible-believing Christians have fractured churches over this.
It's tragic, really.
It is. So our goal today is not to mock any position, but to charitably evaluate the hermeneutical mechanics of the 4 primary views on the timeline.
Let's do it.
Let's start with the most widely known view in modern Western evangelicalism, pre-tribulationism.
So the core thesis of pre-tribulationism is that the church is raptured, removed entirely from the earth before the 7-year tribulation even begins.
Okay.
To understand why this view exists, you really have to understand the theological superstructure underneath it, which is dispensationalism.
Right.
Popularized in the 19th century by John Nelson Darby and later cemented in the American consciousness by the Scofield Reference Bible.
A huge influence.
Massive. Dispensationalism argues for a hard, unyielding distinction between God's program for the church and God's program for ethnic national Israel.
They view the church almost as a parenthesis in history, right?
In classical dispensationalism, yes, God's prophetic clock was ticking for Israel, But when Israel rejected the Messiah, the clock basically paused.
Right.
We are now in the church age. So the pre-tribulation rapture is the mechanism God uses to remove the church from the earth, so he can restart the prophetic clock for Israel during that final 70th week of Daniel.
And the exegetical support they lean on heavily revolves around exemption from God's wrath.
Right.
They point to 1 Thessalonians 1:10, which says, Jesus delivers us from the wrath to come.
Or 1 Thessalonians 5:9.
Right, God has not destined us for wrath, but to obtain salvation. And perhaps the most famous proof text is Revelation 3:10, where Christ tells the church in Philadelphia, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world.
Pastorally, it's a system that offers a tremendous amount of comfort,
It really does.
which completely explains its massive popularity during the anxieties of the 20th century,
Yeah.
the Cold War, nuclear proliferation.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
The appeal is obvious. You will not have to endure the apocalyptic horrors of Revelation 6 through 19.
Right.
But, however, the glaring hermeneutical challenge, and as seminary students, this is what you must critically evaluate, is that it requires a two-stage parousia.
It requires Christ to return secretly to the clouds to rapture the church, hit pause, wait in heaven for 7 years, and then return publicly to the earth in judgment.
Exactly. But the New Testament never explicitly parses the parousia into two distinct phases separated by a gap of years.
Right, as we just proved with the vocabulary.
Right. Parousia and apocalypsis point to a singular, unified, deeply public event. The burden of proof is heavily on the pre-tribulationist to show where the biblical text divides the return into a secret rapture and a later public coming.
They are essentially taking inferences from disparate texts and creating a framework that the text itself doesn't explicitly state. So, moving down the timeline, we hit mid-tribulationism. This view says the church goes through the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, but is raptured right before the Great Tribulation kicks off at the exact midpoint of the 7 years.
And the primary mechanism for the mid-trib view is a fascinating bit of scriptural correlation.
Okay.
They look at 1 Corinthians 15:52, where Paul says believers will be transformed and glorified at the last trumpet.
Right.
Then they flip over to Revelation 11:15, which describes the seventh trumpet, the final trumpet in John's series of judgment trumpets.
I see where this is going.
Since this seventh trumpet happens roughly halfway through the narrative arc of Revelation, they link the two. The last trumpet of Paul must equal the seventh trumpet of John. Therefore, the rapture happens in the middle of the 7 years.
But this is a textbook example of a lexical fallacy.
It really is.
I mean, just because two different authors use the English word trumpet doesn't mean they are describing the exact same event.
Right.
In the Old Testament, trumpets had wildly different functions based entirely on context. A silver trumpet might be blown by the priest to gather the assembly for a festival of worship.
That is a redemptive trumpet.
Right. But a shofar might be blown from the city watchtower to warn of a bloody, invading army. That is a judgment trumpet.
Think of it like hearing a fire alarm and a wedding bell, and assuming they mean the exact same thing just because they both make a loud ringing noise.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
The context determines the meaning of the instrument.
Right.
Equating the redemptive, glorious trumpet of 1 Corinthians 15, which heralds the final victory over death and the resurrection of the saints, with the judgment trumpet of Revelation 11, which brings demonic plagues and ecological destruction upon the wicked, it completely ignores the differing contextual uses of the word.
Right. So, recognizing that exegetical weakness, we see the development of a slightly more nuanced view, the pre-wrath rapture.
Yeah.
This view tries to thread the needle by making a sharp theological distinction between human or satanic persecution and divine wrath.
Pre-wrath advocates argue that the church will endure the majority of the tribulation. They will face the Antichrist. They will endure horrific persecution.
Okay.
But they will be raptured late in the timeline, maybe 3/4 of the way through the 7 years, just before God pours out his final bowl judgments.
The bowl judgments being the unmixed, pure wrath of God.
Exactly. The exegetical support here is rooted in Revelation 16 and 17.
What does that say?
During the sixth seal, the inhabitants of the earth hide in the caves and cry out to the mountains, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath is come, and who can stand?
Okay.
The pre-wrath view looks at that and says, look, God's wrath doesn't officially start until the sixth seal. Everything before that was just the wrath of man or the wrath of Satan.
I see.
And since the church is promised exemption from God's wrath, we endure the persecution, but are raptured right before the bowls report out.
It's an incredibly nuanced position.
Very nuanced.
It respects the biblical promise of exemption from divine wrath, while heavily acknowledging that Christians are promised severe tribulation in this world.
Right.
Think of it like being trapped in a city under siege by an invading enemy. You endure the starvation, you endure the arrows from the enemy, that's the tribulation.
Okay, yeah.
But right before your own military arrives to carpet bomb the city and destroy the enemy, you are airlifted out. You are saved from the friendly fire of your own king's wrath.
It's a great analogy. But the hermeneutical weakness noted by scholars is that the pre-wrath view creates a highly complex, fractured timeline.
How so?
It breaks the cohesive narrative structure of the book of Revelation. It forces you to slice and dice the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls into very rigid, consecutive chronological compartments.
Which many Johannine scholars argue is a complete misreading of the apocalyptic genre.
Exactly.
They argue the seals, trumpets, and bowls aren't purely chronological, they are recapitulations. They are telling the exact same story of the church age from 3 different camera angles, each ending in the final judgment.
Which organically brings us to the fourth major view.
Right.
Post-tribulationism. This is the historic view of the church, held by the overwhelming majority of the early church fathers and the Protestant reformers.
So it's got pedigree.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The thesis is incredibly simple. The church endures the entire tribulation. The rapture and the second coming are not 2 separate events. They occur simultaneously at the very end of the 7 years.
This perfectly aligns with our earlier discussion on the word parousia, the apentatasis, the Greek term for going out to meet a dignitary and escorting them in.
Matthew 24:29-31 is the anchor text for post-tribulationism.
Right.
Jesus says explicitly, immediately after the tribulation of those days, they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect.
Wow.
It's an unbroken, singular parousia narrative. There are no 2 stages. There is no secret removal.
It is remarkably clean syntactically. But here is where the systematic theology hits a massive logistical hurdle.
Okay, let's hear it.
If post-tribulationism is true, and the rapture and the second coming happen at the exact same moment at the end of the tribulation, that means every single living believer on earth is caught up, transformed, and glorified instantly.
According to 1 Corinthians 15, yes.
Yeah.
Paul says, "We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye." All believers receive their immortal, glorified bodies.
Okay, so if all believers are instantly glorified into immortal bodies and all unbelievers are utterly destroyed by the sword coming from Christ's mouth at his return, who populates the earthly millennial kingdom?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Right, because the Old Testament prophecies about the millennium require a population of mortal humans who can still have children, build houses, farmland, and eventually even rebel at the end of the 1,000 years. If every believer is glorified and every unbeliever is dead, there are 0 mortal humans left on earth to enter the millennial kingdom.
You have just put your finger on the absolute cornerstone of all millennial debates.
Really?
That exact question, who populates the millennium, is what forces us to transition from the timing of the tribulation into the interpretation of Revelation chapter 20 and the historical reception of the 1,000-year reign.
Okay.
How the church has interpreted Revelation 20 has generated 3 massive theological superstructures across church history:
Which are?
amillennialism, postmillennialism, and premillennialism.
Let's dive into Revelation 20, verses 1 through 6, where John specifically mentions a period of 1,000 years where Satan is bound and the saints reign with Christ.
Right.
Let's start with amillennialism. The prefix A means no, so it essentially means no millennium, though if you talk to an amillennialist, they will quickly correct you.
Oh, they will.
They prefer the term realized millennialism. They absolutely believe in the millennium. They just define it as a current spiritual reality, not a future political one.
This has been the dominant view of the church since St. Augustine in the 4th century. Yes. And you have to understand why Augustine shifted the church to this view. In the first 3 centuries, the church was heavily persecuted by the Roman Empire. They longed for a literal, future earthly kingdom where Christ would overthrow Rome.
That makes sense.
But then Constantine legalizes Christianity. The persecution stops. Christianity becomes the state religion.
The psychological shift is massive.
Exactly. Suddenly, the church isn't being thrown to the lions. They are sitting in the halls of power.
Right.
So Augustine writes The City of God, and he essentially argues, we are in the kingdom now. The 1,000 years isn't a future literal political reign. It's a symbol for the present church age.
So for the amillennialists, the number 1,000 is just a literary symbol of completeness and perfection.
Yes.
They argue that Satan was decisively bound during Christ's earthly ministry at the first coming. They point to Matthew 12:29, where Jesus talks about binding the strong man in order to plunder his house.
Right, or Colossians 2, where Paul says Christ disarmed the rulers and authorities at the cross.
Right. Satan is currently bound in a very specific way. He is restricted from deceiving the nations and preventing the global expansion of the gospel.
And what about the first resurrection mentioned in Revelation 20, verse 4?
Right, what do they do with that?
The text says the souls of the martyrs came to life and reigned with Christ. And millennialists interpret this first resurrection as spiritual regeneration.
Okay, a new birth.
Exactly, it's the new birth. When you are born again, you are spiritually resurrected, and you are currently reigning with Christ in the heavenly places, as Ephesians 2 says.
This view has held sway for centuries in the Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and many Reformed traditions. And its greatest strength is its beautiful simplicity regarding the end of history.
It really is simple.
It maintains a unified single resurrection and a single general judgment at the end of time. Read John 5:28 and 29. Jesus says, "An hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment."
It's 1 hour, one singular event. Acts 24:15 also speaks of a singular resurrection of both the just and the unjust.
Right.
And millennialism perfectly aligns with this clean two-age structure. There was this present evil age, Christ returns, and boom, the eternal age to come begins. No messy 1,000-year intermediate earthly kingdom required.
But the amillennial view has a massive hermeneutical weakness when it comes to the specific grammar of Revelation 20.
It does.
And it brings us back to reading the text with integrity. The weakness is that it requires shifting interpretation methods mid-vision.
Right.
We will drill down into the Greek grammar of that in just a moment, but keep that tension in mind. Let's look at the second major taxonomy, postmillennialism.
Postmillennialism holds that Christ returns after the millennium. Postmillennium.
Okay.
But their definition of the millennium is quite different. It is the theology of the Golden Age.
The Golden Age.
The core thesis is that the Great Commission will be overwhelmingly, staggeringly successful. The gospel will gradually Christianize global institutions, governments, educational systems, and cultures.
Wow.
Through the power of the Holy Spirit and the preaching of the Word, the world will experience an extended, perhaps literal, 1,000-year period of unprecedented righteousness, peace, and prosperity.
So the world gets better and better, and then Jesus returns to a conquered, Christianized globe.
Exactly.
This view was massively popular during the Puritan era and the First and Second Great Awakenings. Jonathan Edwards was a profound postmillennialist.
He was.
You can easily understand the pastoral appeal. It provides a robust, optimistic theology of God's sovereign triumph in history.
Strongly optimistic.
It gives you an incredible motivation for cultural engagement, for building hospitals, for political reform, for writing Christian literature, because you believe your efforts are quite literally building the millennial kingdom on earth.
It is a theology of total victory. But we have to look at why it largely collapsed as a dominant view in the 20th century.
Historical events.
Historical events totally shattered the theological framework. You have the optimism of the 1800s, and then you slam into the Psalm in World War I.
Brutal.
You hit Auschwitz in World War II. You hit the Soviet gulags. The world was demonstrably not getting more righteous.
And the glaring textual conflict is that postmillennialism struggles to square with the New Testament warnings of end times apostasy.
Right.
You read 2 Timothy 3, where Paul tells Timothy, "Understand this, that in the last days there will come times of difficulty. For people will be lovers of self, lovers of money, proud, arrogant, abusive."
Yeah.
Paul doesn't say things will gradually get perfectly Christianized. Jesus in Matthew 24 says believers will be hated by all nations, and the love of many will grow cold.
Exactly.
Postmillennialism has a very hard time explaining how a global Christian golden age culminates in the intense, horrific, anti-Christian hostility described right before the Parousia.
Which brings us to the third category, premillennialism. This view asserts that Jesus Christ will return bodily to earth before establishing an intermediate literal 1,000-year reign.
Premillennium.
Premillennium.
Yep.
He comes back, sets up his physical kingdom on earth in Jerusalem, rules for millennium, and then the eternal state begins.
But we have to make a very careful distinction here because not all premillennialists are the same.
Very true.
We have historic premillennialism and dispensational premillennialism. Think of these as two entirely different ways of reading the whole Bible, specifically regarding how God deals with Israel and the church.
Right.
Let's use an analogy. Think of God's redemptive plan as a train track.
I like this. In historic premillennialism, which has roots going back to the earliest centuries with fathers like Justin Martyr and Irenaeus, there is only one train on one track.
One train.
The church is viewed as the covenantal fulfillment of Israel. Believers from all ages, Jew and Gentile, are part of one unified people of God. The church is basically just the new cars added to the Israel train. They typically hold to a post-tribulational rapture. The earthly reign of Christ is seen as the vindication of the saints on the earth where they suffered, but it doesn't necessitate a rigid separation between Israel and the church.
But dispensational premillennialism views the tracks entirely differently.
They do.
They argue there are two separate trains on two separate tracks. God has two distinct peoples with two distinct destinies. The church is a heavenly people with heavenly promises. National ethnic Israel is an earthly people with earthly promises.
Therefore, the earthly millennium is absolutely necessary to fulfill God's specific land and throne promises made to ethnic Israel in the Old Testament.
Right.
Promises that dispensationalists adamantly argue cannot be spiritualized and applied to the church. God has to pause the church train via a pre-tribulation rapture to finish the route for the Israel train during the tribulation and the millennium.
So we have the landscape. Amillennialism is the spiritual reign happening right now. Postmillennialism is the golden age of gospel triumph in the future. Premillennialism is the literal future reign of Christ on earth.
That's the overview.
Having surveyed the landscape charitably, we need to dive deep into our source's specific exegetical argument. The texts we are analyzing argue heavily that a literal premillennial posture offers the most cohesive grammatical historical reading of prophecy.
We are moving from the broad taxonomy to the granular text now.
Right. The first major argument for premillennialism is the sequential syntax of Revelation 19 and 20. When you read apocalyptic literature, you have to follow the visionary chronology.
Okay.
In Revelation 19, you have this glorious, unmistakable depiction of the Parousia. Christ appears on a white horse, a sword coming from his mouth, striking down the nations and defeating the beast and the false prophet. They are thrown into the lake of fire.
It is the definitive end of the Antichrist empire.
Yes.
And then immediately, the very next verse, Revelation 20, verse 1, John says, "Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, and he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years."
This is followed by verses 4 through 6, where the resurrected saints reign with Christ.
The natural flow of reading the text is A, then B, then C. Christ returns. He defeats the anti-Christian empire. He binds Satan, and he sets up his kingdom.
It's sequential.
But the amillennial view requires you to read chapter 19 as the absolute end of history, and then read chapter 20 as a recapitulation. A massive rewind button that takes you all the way back to the incarnation of Christ 1,000 years earlier.
To be fair to amillennial scholars, recapitulation does happen in apocalyptic literature.
It does.
We see it earlier in the seal and trumpet judgments of Revelation. But the scholarly pushback here is that reading chapter 20 as a complete historical rewind ruptures John's visionary syntax.
How so?
The Greek conjunction kai eidon and iso links the binding of Satan directly to the defeat of the beast.
Right.
To say the beast is defeated at the second coming in our future, but Satan was bound during the ministry of Christ thousands of years in our past, creates a disjointed chronological sequence that aggressively fights the natural grammar of the text.
But the structural argument pales in comparison to the lexical argument.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Let's zero in on the Greek verb izuzan, spelled E-Z-E-S-A-N.
Yazuzan?
It translates to came to life or lived. In Revelation 20, verse 4, John sees the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus, and the text says they came to life as Zuzan and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years.
Right.
This is what John explicitly calls the first resurrection.
Okay, hold that thought. In the very next breath, verse 5, John says, "The rest of the dead did not come to life as Zuzan," exact same verb, "until the 1,000 years were ended."
Now, Premier amillennial scholars like G.K. Beale will argue that because Revelation is highly symbolic literature, John frequently uses words in two different senses.
Right.
Beale argues that the Azusa in verse 4 is a spiritual resurrection believers coming to life in heaven after they die.
Okay.
And the Azusa in verse 5 is the physical resurrection of unbelievers at the end of time.
I understand the appeal of Beale's argument, but we have to push back with basic linguistic integrity. Please do.
Think about it like a complex legal contract. Imagine you are signing a business agreement.
Okay.
In paragraph 1, it uses the term liquidated. And in paragraph 2, right beneath it in the exact same section, it uses the term liquidated.
Right.
Now, what if the opposing lawyer told you, oh, in paragraph 1, liquidated is purely a metaphor for emotional closure, but in paragraph 2, it literally means we're taking all of your financial assets.
You would reject that contract immediately.
Exactly. Hermeneutical integrity demands that a word means the same thing in the same immediate context unless explicitly stated otherwise by the author.
Right.
If you change the definition of the verb in the span of one sentence without a textual marker, language completely loses its meaning.
That is the exact challenge the amillennialist faces. To borrow your legal analogy, they are defining the exact same word in the exact same paragraph in two completely different, mutually exclusive ways.
Which is problematic, highly. The premillennial argument is that grammatical consistency demands a literal, physical resurrection for both uses of the word. The martyrs are physically resurrected to reign on earth in verse 4, and 1,000 years later, the rest of the dead are physically resurrected for final judgment in verse 5.
It is a devastating lexical argument.
It really is.
But for me, the most compelling evidence for a literal millennium doesn't even come from the book of Revelation. It comes from the Old Testament kingdom passages.
Oh, yeah.
This is where systematic theology really shines, when it connects the dots across the entire biblical canon.
You're talking about the intermediate state prophecies.
Yes. Let's look at Isaiah 65, specifically starting in verse 20.
Okay.
Isaiah is describing a magnificent future age of restoration. He says, "No more shall there be in it an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the young man shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed."
Now, stop and deeply analyze that description. What specific age of redemptive history is Isaiah describing?
Right.
It fundamentally cannot be our present church age, because tragically, infants do still die, and people do not consider a 100-year-old death to be the premature death of a young man.
But it also cannot possibly be the eternal state, the new heavens and new earth of Revelation 21, because in the eternal state, death is completely and permanently abolished.
Right. He will wipe away every tear, and death shall be no more.
Exactly. So Isaiah 65 envisions a bizarre intermediate era.
Very bizarre.
It's an era with vastly prolonged lifespans and phenomenal righteousness, but where death and sin still exist at the margins of society.
Zechariah 14 is even more explicit and problematic for amillennialism.
What does that one say?
It describes the future day of the Lord, where the Messiah physically stands on the Mount of Olives. The mountain is literally split in two. The Lord sets up his kingdom over all the earth.
Okay.
But then, in verses 16 through 21, it says, the surviving nations must travel to Jerusalem year after year to worship the king and celebrate the Feast of Booths. And if any nation refuses to go up, rain will be withheld from them as punishment.
Again, apply the exact same theological test. Is this the present church age?
Absolutely not.
Jesus is not currently physically reigning in Jerusalem, withholding literal rain from geographic nations that don't make an annual pilgrimage.
Right.
Is this the eternal state? No. In the new heavens and new earth, all rebellion is completely eradicated. There are no rebellious nations left to threaten with drought.
So what is it? When we synthesize all of this data, you have to marvel at how a literal premillennial kingdom perfectly accommodates these strange intermediate descriptions.
It really does.
It is a time when the glorified Messiah reigns over a renewed but not yet completely perfected earth. It is the necessary bridge between human history as we know it and the eternal state. It's the Sabbath rest of the earth.
And this brilliant theological architecture provides the answer to the post-tribulation dilemma we raised earlier.
Yes, it does.
Remember the logistical hurdle. If the church endures the tribulation and is glorified at the second coming, who populates the earthly millennium?
The surviving nations.
Yes.
The premillennial answer is that the surviving unbelievers, or the surviving nations from the tribulation, those who were not entirely destroyed by the judgments but enter the kingdom in their natural mortal bodies, are the ones who populate the earth.
Wow.
They repopulate. They build houses and plant vineyards, as Isaiah says. They are ruled over by Christ and the resurrected, glorified saints.
Okay.
And it is from the descendants of these mortal survivors that the final, baffling rebellion in Revelation 20 is drawn at the end of the 1,000 years.
It is a breathtaking realization when you see how the grammar, the syntax of Revelation and the ancient Old Testament prophecies lock together like a puzzle.
It's beautiful.
But we cannot stop at exegesis. We have to ask the so what question. I can hear a pastor or a seminary student listening to this and saying, this is incredibly complex exegesis. It's intellectually fascinating. But why does getting this right matter for my local church on a Tuesday afternoon?
Right.
Why does my millennial view matter when someone is sitting across my desk in a total life crisis?
Because theology is never meant to be left on the whiteboards of academia.
Right.
It must be translated into spiritual formation. To demonstrate this, let's look at a practical case study in pastoral care provided in our sources. Let's introduce a hypothetical but very realistic pastor. We'll call him Pastor Thomas.
Okay, Pastor Thomas.
Yeah.
Let's say Pastor Thomas is shepherding a congregation in a mid-sized city, and his church is facing intense, increasing cultural hostility.
Right.
One of his elders just got fired from a corporate job for holding to biblical sexual ethics.
Which happens.
Church members are facing professional marginalization. They're being ostracized by their extended families.
Yeah.
The cultural temperature is rising rapidly, and the congregation is feeling the heat. They are anxious, and they are looking to Pastor Thomas for answers.
So Pastor Thomas steps into the pulpit on Sunday morning. How does his eschatology impact his preaching and his pastoral care? Let's examine the harm of theological imbalance.
Suppose Pastor Thomas has embraced an overly optimistic, unnuanced postmillennialism.
Oh.
He has been telling his congregation for years that the church is destined to transform the culture, that Christian influence will just keep growing and growing until the golden age arrives.
If that is his hermeneutic, his congregation is going to experience a profound crisis of faith when the cultural persecution hits them.
Exactly.
They will look at the apostasy, the hostility, the rapid loss of cultural power, and they will think, God is failing. The gospel isn't working. We were promised victory, but we are experiencing defeat.
Right.
They were completely unequipped to process suffering because their eschatology promised them uninterrupted cultural dominance.
Right. Now, flip the coin. Suppose Pastor Thomas leans heavily on a hard-line, pre-tribulation escape narrative, but without any pastoral nuance.
Okay.
He constantly preaches, don't worry about the culture, it's all going to burn anyway, and Jesus is going to rapture us out of here before things get truly bad.
If he does that, his flock will be entirely unequipped to endure the very real human and satanic persecution that is currently at their doorstep.
Right, because they expect to leave.
They have been discipled for decades to expect an emergency exit. When they face intense suffering, they might mistakenly think they are suffering the divine wrath of God.
Wow. Yeah.
Or they might think they missed the rapture. Or they might assume God has abandoned them. They have zero theological category for patient, gritty endurance.
This is exactly why the corrective we find in the pre-wrath views critique is so incredibly valuable pastorally, regardless of which official timeline you personally hold.
Yes?
Pastors must teach the crucial biblical distinction between enduring satanic or human persecution and escaping divine wrath.
That is the pastoral crux of eschatology. Jesus promised us in John 16, in this world you will have tribulation.
A guarantee.
That is a blood-bought guarantee. The apostles suffered. The early church suffered. But Paul also promises in 1 Thessalonians, God has not destined us for wrath. That is also a guarantee.
Christ's return is the ultimate fulfillment of God's has said his steadfast covenantal love for his people.
Beautifully put.
So the corrective for Pastor Thomas is that his doctrine must translate into spiritual formation. If he preaches the parousia correctly, as the glorious, triumphant, public arrival of the king to set all things right, he instills a profound sense of hope.
Yeah.
Orthodoxy here produces the orthopraxy of patient endurance. You can lose your job, you can face cultural mocking, you can endure the tribulation of the present age, because you know with absolute unwavering certainty that the king is coming, the veil will be dropped, and true justice will be established on the earth.
Eschatology is the ultimate anchor for a suffering church. It tells the congregation that human history is not just a chaotic wheel spinning out of control. It is a train barreling toward a sovereignly appointed destination.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But we want to leave you, the listener, with some heavy lifting to do.
Always.
This is a graduate level seminar, so we aren't just going to hand you a completed chart and send you on your way. We want you to wrestle with the primary source material. As we close, I have 2 reflection questions for you and your study groups to debate.
The first question deals directly with hermeneutical integrity.
Okay.
How does your current millennial view handle the lexical challenge of the Greek verb izouzen came to life in Revelation 20, verses 4 and 5? Are you maintaining consistent grammatical rules, or are you forced to shift between spiritual and literal lenses in the exact same paragraph to make your theological system work?
That's a great question.
It is a hard question, but you must answer it honestly from the text, not just from tradition.
And the second question focuses on pastoral readiness.
Right. Considering the varied tribulation timelines we discussed today, how does a church leader cultivate a culture of joyful anticipation for the parousia while simultaneously equipping the saints for the grim reality of end times hostility outlined in 2 Timothy 3?
Yeah.
How do you preach genuine hope without preaching escapism?
Those are the exact tensions that forge great theologians and faithful, resilient pastors.
To leave you with a final provocative thought, we started this discussion by pushing back against the modern pop culture view of the rapture as a secret, terrifying disappearance.
We did.
We looked at the ancient Roman words, a royal visit, an unveiling, a splendid rescue arriving in the dark.
The welcoming of the emperor.
Right. If the parousia is indeed a royal visitation, if it is the triumphant king arriving publicly to dwell permanently with his people, vindicating their suffering and establishing his earthly reign, how does viewing the end times through the lens of a coronation rather than a catastrophe fundamentally change the way you worship this coming Sunday? It changes everything about our posture. It means we aren't just singing sad songs on a sinking ship. We are actively rehearsing the anthems for the king's arrival.
Eschatology is ultimately, from beginning to end, about the person of Jesus Christ perfectly fulfilling all of his covenantal promises.
Amen.
Until next time, when we look forward to the eternal state, the new heavens and the new earth, keep digging into the Word, keep studying, and keep looking up.